The desert sun beat down on forward operating base valor like molten copper, turning the airfield tarmac into a shimmering lake of heat. Master Sergeant Laura Bennett stood at the edge of the flight line, her eyes tracking the approach of a C-130 Hercules as it descended through the haze. At 34, Laura carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that true strength didn't need to announce itself. She was of medium height with an athletic build honed by years of rigorous training, her sandy blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and her hazel eyes sharp with observation. She had spent 12 years in the Air Force, most of them as a combat medic and tactical emergency coordinator, and she had seen enough broken bodies and shattered souls to know that survival often depended on who stayed calm when everyone else panicked. The transport plane touched down with a screech of rubber, and Laura watched as the cargo ramp lowered. She was here to oversee the integration of a new joint operations protocol, a role that placed her in an uncomfortable position between the flight crews and the ground combat teams. The base commander had specifically requested her because she had a reputation for bridging gaps, for seeing problems others missed, and for keeping her head when chaos erupted. But not everyone appreciated her. Approach Major Keith Brennan emerged from the operations tent, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. He was a tall man in his early 40s with a sharp, angular face and ice blue eyes that seemed to measure everyone he met and find them wanting. His uniform was immaculate despite the heat, every crease perfect, every ribbon aligned. He had been a fighter pilot before a medical grounding shifted him to command roles, and he carried the arrogance of someone who believed aerial combat was the only measure of true military valor. "Bennett," he said, his tone clipped and dismissive, "I trust you've reviewed the new protocols." Laura turned to face him, her expression neutral. "Yes, sir. I have some concerns about the medical evacuation timelines in the proposed structure." Brennan's eyes narrowed. "Your concerns are noted. Dismissed." It was the same wall she had hit since arriving at Valor 3 weeks earlier. Brennan had made it clear from the start that he viewed her role as unnecessary bureaucracy. Her medical background is soft compared to combat operations, and her presence as an intrusion into what he considered his domain. He had fought the assignment, arguing that tactical decisions should remain with combat veterans, not what he called support personnel. Laura had chosen not to engage. She had learned long ago that some battles were won through patience, not confrontation. But she also knew that Brennan's rigid mindset was creating dangerous gaps in their operational readiness, gaps that could cost lives if left unaddressed. As Brennan walked away, Captain David Morse approached from the hangar. David was a helicopter pilot with 7 years of service, 32 years old, with dark hair, warm brown eyes, and an easy demeanor that masked a sharp tactical mind. He had flown medevac missions in 3 different theaters and had pulled more wounded soldiers from hostile zones than most people would see in a lifetime. "He's going to get someone killed," David said quietly, falling into step beside Laura. Laura glanced at him. "Not if we do our jobs right. He won't listen to you. He barely tolerates me, and it fly his rescue birds." Laura's jaw tightened slightly. "Then we make sure the systems work despite him." What neither of them knew yet was that within 48 hours, a catastrophic equipment failure and Brennan's refusal to acknowledge warning signs would place the entire base in jeopardy. And the only person positioned to see the disaster coming would be the one major Brennan had spent weeks dismissing as too soft for combat. The afternoon heat pressed down like a physical weight. And somewhere in the distance, the first faint rumble of thunder rolled across the desert horizon. Part 2. The first cracks. The briefing room was stifling despite the rattling air conditioning unit struggling against the desert heat. Laura sat at the far end of the conference table, her tablet open to the medical logistics report she had spent the previous night compiling. Around her sat the base's senior staff, operations officers, flight coordinators, and Major Brennan at the head of the table, his posture rigid with authority. "The primary concern," Lavra began, her voice steady, "is the gap between our current medevac response time and the protocol requirements. We're averaging 18 minutes from casualty report to wheels up. The new Joint Operations Standard requires 12. Brennan didn't look up from the documents in front of him. 18 minutes is acceptable. Sir, with respect, the standard exists because field studies show that 6-minute reduction significantly improves survival rates for critical injuries." Now Brennan looked up, his ice blue eyes fixed on her with cold precision. "Master Sergeant, I'm aware of what studies show. I'm also aware of operational realities. We have limited aircraft, limited crews, and a mission tempo that doesn't allow for perfect response times." Lavra kept her expression neutral. "I'm not suggesting perfection, sir. I'm suggesting we identify the bottlenecks causing the delay. My analysis shows the primary issue is communication lag between the ground medical teams and flight operations." Captain Morse leaned forward. "She's right, sir. Half the delay comes from relay protocols. If we streamline the alert system, Brennan interrupted, his tone sharpening, was designed by personnel with combat experience. Unlike some contributors to this discussion." The room went silent. Lavra felt the weight of every gaze shift toward her, some sympathetic, others uncomfortable. She had known this moment would come. Brennan had spent 3 weeks undermining her authority in small ways, excluding her from planning sessions, dismissing her input in meetings, making pointed comments about support roles versus combat roles. But she had also spent 12 years learning not to take the bait. "My recommendations are based on data, sir," Lavra said calmly, "not personal experience claims." Brennan's jaw tightened. "Your recommendations are based on theory. Ideal in reality." The meeting continued, but Laura's suggestions were systematically dismissed. When she raised concerns about the aging medical equipment in the field hospital, Brennan noted it was functional enough. When she pointed out gaps in the emergency supply chain, he said logistics was not her department. After the meeting, Lavra walked across the compound toward the medical tent, the afternoon sun pressing down like judgment. She felt the familiar weight of frustration. Not at being challenged, she welcomed honest debate, but at being dismissed without consideration. David caught up with her near the flight line. "That was brutal." "That was predictable," Lavra replied. "He's not going to change his mind about you." Lavra stopped and turned to face him. "This isn't about me. It's about making sure we're ready when something goes wrong." David's expression sobered. "You think something's coming?" Laura looked past him toward the rows of helicopters and transport planes shimmering in the heat. "I think we're operating on assumptions that haven't been tested. And assumptions kill people." What she didn't say aloud was that she had noticed something troubling in the maintenance log she had reviewed that morning. The base's primary medevac helicopter, a UH-60 Blackhawk, had flagged intermittent hydraulic pressure readings during the past 4 flights. The issue had been logged, inspected, and cleared by the maintenance crew. But Laura's training had taught her that intermittent problems rarely resolve themselves. They escalated. She had raised the concern in the briefing. Buried in her broader logistics report, Brennan had dismissed it as overcautious. That night, as Lavra lay in her quarters, listening to the desert wind rattle the thin walls, she reviewed her notes one more time. The patterns were there if you knew how to read them. Delayed response times, aging equipment, communication gaps, and a commanding officer who valued protocol over adaptation. She thought about the young soldiers she had treated over the years, the ones who had survived because someone had anticipated failure before it happened, and she thought about Major Brennan's certainty, the kind of confidence that came from never having been proven catastrophically wrong Somewhere across the base, in the maintenance hangar, a small hydraulic seal continued to degrade, invisible and silent, counting down toward failure. Part 3. Pressure rising. Following morning arrived with a sandstorm warning that turned the sky the color of old bruises. Laura moved through her rounds in the field hospital, checking supplies and reviewing patient charts with the quiet efficiency that defined her work. The storm put ground flights for most of the day, which meant a temporary reprieve from operations, but also meant that if an emergency arose, response options would be severely limited. She was restocking trauma supplies when Lieutenant Sarah Chun, one of the base's flight medics, approached with a troubled expression. Sarah was 28, sharp and dedicated, with 3 years of combat medical experience. "Sergeant Bennett, I need to talk to you about something." Laura set down the supply box. "What's wrong?" Sarah glanced around to make sure they were alone. "I heard what Major Brennan said in the briefing yesterday about you not having combat experience." "It's fine, Lieutenant. I've dealt with worse." "It's not fine," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "Half the medical staff knows you saved lives in situations most of us will never face. You were at Bagram during the mortar attack in 2016. You coordinated triage for 43 casualties with a collapsed trauma bay." Laura's expression tightened slightly. She didn't talk about Bagram. Most people who had been there didn't. That was a long time ago. It was 8 years ago, and people still talk about it in training courses. Sarah pressed. "Brennan has no right to question your credibility." Laura appreciated the loyalty, but she also knew that defending her wouldn't change Brennan's mind. It would only make Sarah a target. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant, but right now I need you focused on keeping this medical unit running, not fighting my battles." Sarah hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Yes, Sergeant." After Sarah left, Laura stood alone in the supply tent, listening to the wind howl outside. The truth was that Bagram had changed her. She had walked into that mortar attack as a competent medic and walked out as someone who understood that chaos didn't respect rank, protocol, or preparation. She had learned that survival often came down to one person making the right call in the worst possible moment, and she had learned that the people most confident in their control were often the least prepared when that control shattered. Later that afternoon, Laura was reviewing maintenance logs in her makeshift office when Captain Morse appeared in the doorway, his flight suit dusted with sand. "You were right about the Black Hawk," he said without preamble. Laura looked up sharply. "What happened?" "Maintenance ran a deeper diagnostic after the storm grounded us. They found microfractures in the hydraulic line casing. The pressure fluctuations you flagged weren't sensor errors. They were real. If that line had failed mid-flight... He didn't need to finish. A catastrophic hydraulic failure in a medevac helicopter could mean losing the aircraft, the crew, and any casualties on board." Laura felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Has Major Brennan been informed?" David's expression darkened. "He said it proves the maintenance protocols work. The issue was caught and fixed." "It was caught because I raised the flag. He's not going to give you credit for that." Laura stood, her jaw set. "I don't need credit. I need him to start listening before something happens that we can't fix." But even as she said it, she felt the weight of inevitability. Brennan wasn't going to change. He had built his command on certainty and control, and admitting that a medical sergeant with no flight experience had identified a critical safety issue would undermine everything he believed about hierarchy and expertise. That evening, as the sandstorm intensified and the base battened down for the night, Laura sat in the mess hall across from David. They ate in tired silence, surrounded by the low murmur of other soldiers seeking refuge from the wind. "You know what the worst part is?" David said finally. Laura looked up. "He's not a bad officer. He's smart, He's dedicated. He genuinely believes he's doing the right thing. But he's so locked into his view of how things should work that he can't see what's actually happening. Laura nodded slowly. People like that don't change until reality forces them to. And by then, it's usually too late. Outside, the storm raged against the compound walls, a wall of sand and fury that blotted out the stars. And somewhere in the dark, the first pieces of the coming disaster were already in motion, invisible and inevitable, waiting for the moment when confidence would collide with catastrophe. Part 4. The breaking point, the sandstorm broke just before dawn, leaving the base covered in a fine layer of ochre dust that turned everything the same muted color. Laura was in the medical tent conducting morning inventory when the alert siren cut through the quiet, a sharp, piercing wail that sent everyone into immediate motion. Mass casualty event, the loudspeaker announced. Convoy strike 15 kilometers northeast. Multiple wounded. All medical and flight personnel report immediately. Laura's training took over. She grabbed her field pack and sprinted toward the operations center, where Captain Morse was already running pre-flight checks on the Black Hawk. Other medics scrambled to load supplies while ground crews fueled the aircraft. Major Brennan emerged from the command post, his face tight with focus. Status? 6 wounded, 2 critical, the operations officer reported. IED strike on a supply convoy. Ground transport is compromised by terrain. Get the Black Hawk airborne, Brennan ordered. Full medevac crew. Laura moved toward the helicopter, but Brennan's voice stopped her. Not you, Bennett. I need experienced flight medics on this one. Laura turned, incredulous. Sir, I've logged over 200 medevac missions. In training rotations. This is active combat recovery. Sir, every second we delay. That's an order, Master Sergeant. The words hit like a physical blow, but Laura forced herself to stay professional. Yes, sir. She watched as Lieutenant Chun and another medic boarded the Black Hawk. David caught her eye from the pilot's seat, his expression grim. He knew this was wrong, but he also knew there was no time to argue. The helicopter lifted off, rotors churning the dusty air, and disappeared toward the northeast. Laura stood on the flight line, her hands clenched at her sides, watching until the aircraft became a dark speck against the pale morning sky. Beside her, a young supply corporal spoke quietly. That's messed up, Sergeant. Everyone knows you're one of the best. Laura didn't respond. She was too busy calculating timelines, reviewing what she knew about the convoy's location, and running through worst-case scenarios. The Black Hawk had been cleared after the hydraulic repair, but the work had been rushed due to the storm. If there were any remaining weaknesses in the system, 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The radio crackled in the operations center. Laura had positioned herself just outside, close enough to hear. Valor Base. This is Rescue 1. We have all 6 casualties on board. 2 critical stable, en route to. Static. Then David's voice, tight with tension. Valor Base, we have a hydraulic warning light. Running diagnostics. Laura's blood turned to ice. Rescue 1, what's your status? The operations officer called. More static then. Hydraulic pressure dropping. We're losing flight control authority. Attempting emergency landing. Brennan pushed into the radio room. Rescue 1, what's your position? 8 kilometers out. Descending through. The transmission cut to a scream of tearing metal and a horrible sound of impact. Then silence. The operations center erupted into controlled chaos. Brennan was shouting orders. Crews were scrambling to launch the backup helicopter. And somewhere in the noise, Laura heard someone say the words no one wanted to hear. Crash site confirmed. Laura didn't wait for permission. She grabbed a trauma pack and ran toward the remaining Huey helicopter being prepped for launch. The crew chief tried to wave her off, but she climbed aboard anyway. Sergeant, You're not authorized. 8 people just went down, Laura said, her voice like steel. You can court-martial me later. The pilot, a grizzled warrant officer named Frank Hayes, met her eyes in the mirror. Something passed between them, an understanding born of too many years watching protocol collide with reality. Strap in, Hayes said as the Huey lifted off. Laura looked down and saw Major Brennan standing on the flight line, his face a mask of shock and something that might have been the first crack in his certainty. The crash site came into view. 5 minutes later, a torn scar in the desert where the Black Hawk had gone down hard. The aircraft had rolled. The tail boom sheared away. The cabin partially collapsed. Hayes brought the Huey down 100 meters away. Laura was moving before the skids touched Earth. Her medical pack slung across her shoulders. Her mind already triaging from visual assessment. David Morse was pulling himself from the wreckage, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. When he saw Laura, relief flooded his face. Sarah's trapped, he gasped. And the casualties. Laura was already at the wreck, assessing, calculating, moving with the practiced precision of someone who had done this in her nightmares. The convoy casualties were injured but stable. Lieutenant Chen was pinned by a collapsed bulkhead, conscious but in shock. I've got you, Sarah, Laura said, her voice calm despite the chaos. Stay with me. For the next 40 minutes, Laura worked with the focused intensity that had earned her reputation. She stabilized Chen, coordinated the extraction of casualties, and managed 3 simultaneous medical emergencies. While the rescue crews cut through twisted metal by the time the backup teams arrived, every person from the crash had been stabilized and prepared for transport. Major Brennan arrived on the second wave. He found Laura covered in dust and blood, kneeling beside Lieutenant Chen as the young medic was loaded onto a stretcher. Their eyes met across the wreckage, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. But Laura didn't wait for his words. She turned back to her patients, because that's what she did. She saved lives, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Part 5. The gathering evidence. The base fell into an eerie calm in the hours following the crash. The wounded had been evacuated to the field hospital, where Laura worked alongside the trauma team with methodical precision. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had a fractured pelvis and would need to be airlifted to Landstuhl Medical Center in Germany, but she would survive. Captain David Morse had a concussion and multiple lacerations, but he had already tried to leave his hospital bed twice to check on his crew. The convoy casualties were stable, their injuries painful, but not life-threatening. Laura worked through the afternoon and into the evening, her hands steady despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. She had learned long ago how to compartmentalize, to push aside fear, anger, and frustration until the immediate crisis passed. But now, as the last patient was settled and the medical tent quieted, the weight of what had happened began to settle over her. She stepped outside into the desert night, the air cool after the day's heat. Above her, stars scattered across the darkness like shattered glass. Infinite and indifferent. You saved their lives. Laura turned to find Major Brennan standing a few meters away, his uniform rumpled, his face drawn with something that looked like exhaustion or shame or both. I did my job, Laura said quietly. Brennan moved closer, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that might have been military discipline or an attempt to hold himself together. The crash investigation team arrived an hour ago. Preliminary findings show complete hydraulic system failure. The repair after your initial flag didn't address the underlying structural degradation. Laura said nothing. She knew what was coming. If the Black Hawk had been carrying a full combat load instead of medical personnel, if it had been at altitude over hostile terrain instead of 8 kilometers from base. Brennan's voice trailed off. You tried to warn me. Multiple times. Yes, sir, I did. Brennan looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since she had arrived at FOB Valor. "Why didn't you push harder? Why didn't you go over my head?" Lavra considered the question carefully. "Because I believed that eventually the evidence would speak louder than I could. And because going over your head would have undermined your command authority and damaged unit cohesion. I thought I had more time to make my case." "You were wrong about that." "Yes, sir. I was." The admission hung between them, honest and painful. Brennan nodded slowly, then turned to leave. But he paused at the edge of the tent. "The investigation team wants to interview you tomorrow morning. They'll want to know everything, your initial concerns, my responses, the timeline of warnings." He met her eyes. "Tell them the truth." "I always do, sir." After Brennan left, Laura sat on a supply crate and allowed herself a moment to simply breathe. She pulled out her tablet and opened the file she had been building since arriving at Valor, a detailed log of every safety concern she had raised, every dismissal, every gap in protocol. She had kept it not as ammunition, but as documentation, because her training had taught her that memories failed under stress, but records endured. Now, those records would tell a story she had never wanted to have to tell. The next morning, the investigation team set up in a conference room that had been cleared for their use. There were 3 of them: a lieutenant colonel from Air Force Safety, a senior warrant officer from Accident Investigation, and a legal officer from JAG. They were professional, thorough, and interested only in facts. Laura spent 4 hours walking them through everything: her initial review of maintenance logs, the hydraulic pressure anomalies she had flagged, the communication gaps in medevac protocols, and Major Brennan's systematic dismissal of her concerns. She provided documentation for every claim, her tablet filled with dated notes, email exchanges, and incident reports. "Master Sergeant," the lieutenant colonel said near the end of the interview, "you demonstrated exceptional attention to detail and professional courage in raising these issues. Why do you believe your concerns were not adequately addressed?" Lavra chose her words carefully. "Major Brennan is a skilled officer with extensive operational experience. I believe he viewed my recommendations through the lens of his own expertise and found them inconsistent with his understanding of how systems should function. He valued practical experience over analytical projection. That's a diplomatic way of saying he dismissed you because you're a medical sergeant with no flight command experience," the warrant officer said bluntly. Lavra met his eyes. "I'm saying that institutional bias can make it difficult for subject matter experts to be heard across specialization boundaries." The legal officer made a note. "Are you aware that similar concerns about Major Brennan's leadership style have been raised by other personnel?" Laura felt a chill run through her. "No, I was not aware of that." The lieutenant colonel leaned forward. "In the past 6 months, 3 separate officers have filed informal complaints about Major Brennan's unwillingness to consider input from personnel he deems insufficiently qualified. None of those complaints were elevated because they didn't involve safety incidents. Until now," the warrant officer added. Laura realized with sudden clarity that this investigation was about more than just a helicopter crash. It was about a pattern of behavior, a command climate that prioritized hierarchy over competence, and a system that had failed to address warning signs until catastrophe forced the issue. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. The lieutenant colonel closed his folder. "We complete our investigation, compile our findings, and make recommendations to the base commander and theater command. Major Brennan has been temporarily relieved of operational authority pending the outcome." After the interview, Lavra walked back toward the medical tent, her mind churning. She felt no satisfaction in Brennan's relief, only a weary recognition that the system was finally paying attention, but only because people had been hurt. Captain Morse found her near the flight line. where she stood watching mechanics work on the remaining helicopters. His head was bandaged, and he moved stiffly, but his eyes were clear. "You did the right thing," he said. Laura shook her head. "The right thing would have been preventing the crash in the first place. You tried." He wouldn't listen. Trying isn't enough when people get hurt. David was quiet for a moment. "Sarah asked me to give you something." He handed Laura a small handwritten note. In Lieutenant Chen's careful script, it read, "Thank you for not giving up on us, even when we couldn't hear you." Laura folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket, where it rested against her heart like a promise that speaking truth mattered, even when no one listened, because eventually, inevitably, reality would demand an accounting. Part 6. The tide turns. The investigation team remained at FOB Valor for 5 days, conducting interviews, reviewing records, and reconstructing the sequence of failures that led to the crash. Laura watched from the periphery as the base transformed around the wound. Inquiry personnel became more careful in their documentation. Commanders double-checked decisions that previously would have been reflexive. And a subtle shift occurred in how people moved through the compound. As if everyone was suddenly aware they were being observed, Major Brennan remained confined to administrative duties, replaced temporarily by Lieutenant Colonel Angela Rivers, a no-nonsense logistics officer with 20 years of service who had flown in from Bagram to assume operational command. Rivers was in her mid-40s, compact and intense, with salt and pepper hair and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. Her first act was to call Laura to her office. "Master Sergeant Bennett." "Sit down." Rivers gestured to a chair across from her desk, which was already covered in reports and operational charts. "I've read your file. I've also read every piece of documentation related to this investigation. You've built a hell of a case." Laura remained at attention. "I documented concerns as they arose, ma'am. Standard procedure. Standard procedure is to make a note and hope someone listens. You built a chronological, evidence-based narrative that's making a lot of senior officers very uncomfortable." Rivers leaned back in her chair. "Do you know what happens when people like you force the system to confront its failures?" "No, ma'am." "Two things. Either you get crushed by the people who don't want to admit they were wrong, or you get elevated because the system realizes it needs more people like you." Rivers paused. "I'm here to make sure it's the second option." Laura felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, exactly, but recognition that someone finally understood what she had been trying to do. "The investigation team is recommending significant changes to base protocols," Rivers continued. "Enhanced cross-specialty review for safety concerns, mandatory consideration of subject matter expert input regardless of rank or specialty, and revised maintenance procedures for all flight systems. They're also recommending that you be appointed as the permanent safety integration officer for forward operating bases in this theater." Laura's eyes widened slightly. "Ma'am, I'm a medical sergeant. You're a medical sergeant who has prevented God knows how many future disasters by refusing to shut up when it mattered." Rivers' expression softened slightly. "The Air Force needs people who see problems before they become catastrophes. That's a rare skill, Bennett. Don't waste it by thinking you're not qualified." That afternoon, Laura was summoned to attend a commander's briefing with the investigation team. The conference room was packed with senior officers, including the base commander, Colonel Marcus Harwell, a stern man in his 50s who had commanded Valor for 2 years. The lieutenant colonel from the investigation team stood at the front of the room, a presentation displayed on the screen behind him. "Our findings are clear," he began. "The crash of Rescue 1 was the result of systemic failures in communication, maintenance oversight, and command climate. While the immediate cause was hydraulic system degradation, the root cause was institutional resistance to cross-specialty safety input." He clicked to the next slide. which showed a timeline of Laura's documented concerns and Brennan's responses. Master Sergeant Bennett identified the hydraulic anomaly 6 days before the crash. She raised the concern through proper channels. Her input was documented and dismissed. When she elevated the concern, she was told she lacked the operational experience to assess flight system reliability. The room was silent. Lavra sat in the back, her face carefully neutral, but she could feel the weight of attention shifting toward her. The investigation. Team finds that Major Brennan's command. Decisions were influenced by bias against non-flight personnel and an unwillingness to consider technical input from specialists outside his operational expertise. We further find that Master Sergeant Bennett's actions were professional, appropriate, and potentially life-saving had her initial recommendations been implemented. The crash would likely have been prevented. Colonel Harwell spoke for the first time. "Where is Major Brennan now?" "Awaiting disposition recommendations, sir," the legal officer replied. "Given the severity of the command climate issues and the pattern of similar incidents, we're recommending reassignment to a non-operational role pending further review." Harwell nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he looked directly at Lavra. "Master Sergeant Bennett, stand up." Lavra rose, her heart pounding. "You've put this command in a difficult position," Harwell said, his voice carrying across the room. "You've forced us to confront failures we should have caught ourselves. You've documented institutional problems that reflect poorly on leadership at multiple levels." Lavra braced herself for what felt like inevitable censure. "You've also," Harwell continued, "demonstrated exactly the kind of professional courage and technical expertise this Air Force is supposed to value. The investigation team has recommended you for a commendation for your actions during and after the crash, and I'm endorsing that recommendation. Additionally, I'm implementing their proposal to create a Safety Integration Officer position, and I'm appointing you to fill it effective immediately." The room erupted in a scattered applause that felt more like acknowledgement than celebration. Lavra stood frozen, processing the sudden shift. After the briefing, as officers filed out, Lieutenant Colonel Rivers approached Laura with a slight smile. "Congratulations, Officer Bennett. You just changed how this base operates." Laura shook her head slowly. "I just wanted to prevent people from getting hurt." "I know," Rivers said. "That's why you're the right person for this job." That evening, Laura visited Lieutenant Chun in the medical ward. Sarah was scheduled for transport to Germany the following morning, but her spirits had improved dramatically. "I heard about your promotion," Sarah said, her face lighting up. "The whole medical unit is talking about it." Laura pulled up a chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got crushed by a helicopter, but grateful to be alive." Sarah's expression turned serious. "You saved my life twice, Sergeant. Once when you flagged that hydraulic issue, and once when you pulled me out of the wreck. I won't forget that." Lavra squeezed Sarah's hand gently. "You would have done the same for me." "Maybe," Sarah said. "But I don't know if I would have had the courage to keep pushing when everyone told me I was wrong." As Lavra walked back to her quarters that night, she passed the flight line where crews were conducting evening maintenance checks that now included additional safety protocols and cross-specialty reviews. The changes were small, incremental, barely visible to anyone not looking for them. But Lavra had learned that the most important changes often were. Somewhere in the darkness, a helicopter rotor turned in the wind. And Lavra thought about all the lives that might be saved by people who would never know her name, never know the fight she had fought, never know how close they had come to disaster. And she thought that maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Part 7. The Reckoning. The formal hearing took place 2 weeks after the crash, in a sterile conference room at Regional Command Headquarters, 300 kilometers from FOB Valar. Lavra had been flown in along with Lieutenant Colonel Rivers. Captain Morse, and several other witnesses. The proceeding wasn't a court-martial. Major Keith Brennan hadn't committed a crime, but it carried the weight of one. This was an administrative review board convened to determine his fitness for continued command and to assess whether his actions had created an unsafe command climate. Laura sat in the waiting area outside the hearing room, her dress uniform crisp and uncomfortable after weeks in tactical gear. Beside her, David Morse fidgeted with his cover, the bandage on his forehead now reduced to a small adhesive strip. "You nervous?" he asked quietly. Laura considered the question. "I'm prepared. That's not the same thing." Before she could respond, the door opened and a sergeant called her name. "Master Sergeant Bennett, the board is ready for your testimony." The hearing room was smaller than she expected, dominated by a long table where 3 senior officers sat, a brigadier general serving as the board president, a full colonel from the inspector general's office, and a lieutenant colonel from personnel. Major Brennan sat to one side with his legal counsel, a JAG captain who looked young and overwhelmed. Brennan's appearance shocked Laura. In just 2 weeks, he seemed to have aged years. His uniform was perfect, his posture military correct, but his eyes held a hollow quality that spoke of someone confronting truths they had spent a lifetime avoiding. The brigadier general, a woman named Patricia Lawson with silver hair and an expression carved from granite, gestured to the witness chair. "Master Sergeant Bennett, please be seated. You've been called to provide testimony regarding the command climate at Forward Operating Base Valor and the events leading to the UH-60 crash on the 8th of this month. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Let's begin with your initial concerns about the Black Hawk's maintenance status. Walk us through your observations and how you communicated them." For the next 90 minutes, Laura laid out the complete timeline. She spoke clearly and factually, presenting documentation at each step, her initial review of maintenance logs, the hydraulic pressure anomalies she had identified, her formal safety report, and the subsequent dismissals of her concerns. She described the briefing where Brennan had questioned her credibility, the pattern of excluded input, and the moment she had been barred from the medevac mission. Throughout her testimony, Laura was careful to focus on actions and decisions rather than character assessments. She didn't call Brennan arrogant or dismissive. She simply described what he had said and done, letting the record speak for itself. When she finished, the colonel from the IG's office leaned forward. "Master Sergeant, in your professional opinion, could the crash have been prevented if your initial recommendations had been implemented?" Laura chose her words carefully. "The investigation team's findings indicate that the hydraulic degradation was progressive. Early intervention based on the anomalies I identified would have required replacement of the entire hydraulic assembly. That repair would have grounded the aircraft during the period when the crash occurred. So yes, sir, I believe implementation of my recommendations would have prevented this specific incident." The brigadier general made a note, then looked at Brennan. "Major, do you wish to question this witness?" Brennan conferred briefly with his counsel, then stood. His voice was steady, but lacked its former certainty. "Master Sergeant Bennett, did you at any time believe I was acting with malicious intent or deliberately endangering personnel?" Laura met his eyes. "No, sir. I believed you were making decisions based on your understanding of operational priorities and your assessment of risk. But you believed my assessment was wrong." "Yes, sir. I believed the evidence supported a different conclusion." Brennan nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. No further questions. The board heard from other witnesses throughout the day. Captain Morse, who testified about the crash itself, the maintenance chief, who explained the limitations of the initial hydraulic inspection, and several junior officers who described the general command climate at Valor. Each testimony added another layer to the picture of a leader who had valued certainty over consultation Experience over evidence. But the most devastating testimony came from Lieutenant Colonel Rivers, who presented data showing that under Brennan's command, safety reports from non-flight personnel had dropped by 60% compared to previous command periods, not because there were fewer concerns, but because people had learned their input wouldn't be valued. What you see here, Rivers said, gesturing to a chart, is a command climate that systematically discouraged cross-specialty communication. Master Sergeant Bennett was unusual, not because she identified problems, but because she refused to stop identifying them when she was told to be quiet. At the end of the day, the board went into closed deliberation. Laura was told to remain available, but was excused from the hearing room. She found a quiet corner in the headquarters building and sat watching the sun descend toward the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. David found her there an hour later. They've reached a decision. The board reconvened with all parties present. Brigadier General Lawson's expression was grave as she read from the findings. This board finds that Major Keith Brennan exercised poor judgment in his handling of safety concerns at forward operating base. Valor, we find that his command climate discouraged input from qualified specialists and that his decisions directly contributed to the circumstances leading to the crash of Rescue 1. While we do not find evidence of criminal conduct or malicious intent, we find that Major Brennan has demonstrated a pattern of leadership failures inconsistent with continued operational command. Lawson looked directly at Brennan. Major Brennan, you are hereby relieved of command and reassigned to a non-operational administrative position pending further review. You will not hold command authority over personnel or flight operations. This reassignment will be reflected in your permanent record. Additionally, you are required to complete enhanced leadership training focused on cross-functional team management and safety culture. Brennan stood at attention, his face expressionless, and accepted the decision with a single word: understood. But as the hearing adjourned and people began filing out, Brennan approached Lavra. His counsel tried to stop him, but he waved the captain away. Master Sergeant, he said quietly. Laura turned to face him. I spent 15 years believing that leadership meant having answers, making decisions, and never showing doubt. Brennan's voice was raw with something that might have been grief. I thought people who questioned me were challenging my authority. I never considered they might be trying to save me from my own blindness. Lover said nothing, sensing he needed to finish. 8 people nearly died because I couldn't see past my own certainty. Lieutenant Chun will carry the injuries from that crash for the rest of her life. And you did everything right, and I punished you for it. He met her eyes. I can't undo that, but I want you to know I finally understand what you were trying to tell me. Reality doesn't care about my rank or my experience. It just is. Lavra felt the weight of his words, the cost of the lesson he had learned. Sir, I hope you find a way to use this experience to help others avoid the same mistakes. Brennan nodded once, then turned and walked away, his shoulders carrying a burden that would never fully lift as Lavra left the headquarters building. Lieutenant Colonel Rivers fell into step beside her. How do you feel? Rivers asked. Laura considered the question. Like justice was done, but at too high a price. That's usually how justice works, Rivers said. The question is what we do with it. And as they walked into the desert evening, Lavra thought about all the future crashes that might never happen, all the voices that might now be heard, all the lives that might be saved by a system that had finally, painfully, learned to listen. Part 8. The Quiet Strength. 3 months after the hearing, Lavra stood in the same briefing room at FOB Valor, where she had once fought to have her voice heard. But the room felt different now. The energy had shifted from rigid hierarchy to something more collaborative, more willing to question and adapt. She was presenting the quarterly safety review to the base command staff, a role that would have been unthinkable before the crash. Lieutenant Colonel Rivers sat at the head of the table, having been appointed as Valor's permanent commander. Around the table sat department heads from operations, maintenance, medical, and logistics, a deliberately cross-functional group that Rivers had insisted upon. Our safety incident rate has dropped by 42% over the past 3 months, Lavra reported, clicking to a slide showing the trend data. We've also seen a 68% increase in proactive safety reports from all personnel levels. The integration of cross-specialty review protocols has been particularly effective in identifying issues before they become critical. A major from operations raised his hand. Master Sergeant, we've had some pushback from flight crews who feel the additional safety checks are slowing down mission tempo. How do we balance thoroughness with operational efficiency? Lavra had anticipated the question. The data shows that the additional time spent on safety checks has actually reduced overall mission delays by preventing equipment failures and emergency groundings. We're spending more time on prevention and less on crisis response. But I'd like to hear directly from the flight crews about their specific concerns. What feels redundant? What feels valuable? The goal is smart safety, not bureaucratic safety. The major nodded, seeming satisfied. This kind of dialogue, respectful challenge, and collaborative problem-solving had become the new normal at Valor. After the briefing, Lavra walked across the compound toward the medical tent, where she still spent part of each day treating patients and training medics. The dual role suited her, allowing her to maintain her clinical skills while building a safety culture that extended beyond any single specialty. She found Captain Morse in the hangar, inspecting one of the Black Hawks with a maintenance crew. David had returned to flight status 6 weeks earlier, and he approached each mission now with a visible attention to detail that hadn't been there before. "How's she looking?" Laura asked. David patted the helicopter's fuselage affectionately. "Clean bill of health. We replaced the entire hydraulic system on both birds, upgraded the diagnostic sensors, and implemented the new inspection protocols you designed." He grinned. "Takes twice as long, prevents about 100% more crashes. I'll take that trade." They walked together toward the flight line, where the late afternoon sun turned the desert landscape into shades of gold and amber. "I heard from Sarah," David said. "She's finishing physical therapy in Germany. Says she'll be ready for limited duty in another month." Laura smiled. Lieutenant Chen had been determined to return to service despite her injuries, driven by the same resilience that had helped her survive the crash. "She's stronger than she knows. She learned that from you." Laura shook her head. She already had it. She just needed permission to believe in it. A transport plane rumbled overhead, descending toward the runway. Laura watched it land, thinking about all the complex systems that had to function perfectly for something as heavy as an aircraft to fly, and about how safety was never one big decision, but thousands of small choices, made by people who cared enough to do things right. That evening, Laura received an unexpected message through official channels. Major Keith Brennan had requested permission to send her a letter. She approved the request, curious and a little wary. The letter arrived 2 days later, handwritten on plain paper. "Master Sergeant Bennett, I'm writing from my new assignment at Personnel Command, where I've been placed in charge of developing leadership training modules for mid-career officers. It's humbling work teaching others how to avoid the mistakes I made, but it feels necessary. I spent the past months thinking about what went wrong at Valor, and I've come to understand that my greatest failure wasn't technical, it was moral. I believed that certainty was strength, that admitting doubt was weakness, and that my experience gave me the right to dismiss expertise I didn't personally possess. You showed me a different kind of strength to speak truth to power, to persist when ignored, to maintain integrity when it would have been easier to stay silent. That's real leadership, and I wish I had recognized it sooner. The training modules I'm developing now include case studies from the Valor incident. Your actions are being taught as an example of professional courage and ethical responsibility. I hope that helps prevent other leaders from making my mistakes. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that your example continues to save lives, even if you never see it happen. Respectfully, Major Keith Brennan. Laura read the letter twice, then carefully filed it away. She didn't need Brennan's redemption, but she recognized the value in his transformation. He had learned the lesson, and now he was trying to teach it to others. That mattered. 6 months after the crash, FOB Valor hosted a ceremony recognizing personnel who had demonstrated exceptional service. Laura stood in her dress uniform as Lieutenant Colonel. Rivers pinned the Airman's Medal to her chest, the Air Force's highest peacetime award for heroism. Master Sergeant Laura Bennett. Rivers announced to the assembled personnel, for extraordinary heroism in the rescue of 8 personnel following the crash of Rescue 1, and for sustained professional courage in identifying and documenting safety concerns that led to systemic improvements in base operations. Your actions exemplify the Air Force core values of integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. The applause was genuine and sustained. Laura saw familiar faces in the crowd: David Morse, medical staff she had trained with, flight crews whose lives might have been saved by protocols she had helped create, junior enlisted personnel who now knew their voices could matter, regardless of rank. But the moment that struck her most deeply came after the ceremony, when a young airman first class approached her nervously. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you. I'm a maintenance tech, and I've been seeing some weird readings on one of our transport planes. I was scared to say anything because I'm new, and I thought people would tell me I didn't know what I was talking about. But then I heard about what you did, and I filed a safety report anyway." Laura looked at the young woman, seeing herself years earlier, seeing every person who had ever been told their concerns didn't matter. "What happened with your report?" "They took it seriously, ma'am. They found a cracked manifold that could have failed during flight. My supervisor said I might have prevented a crash." The airman's eyes shone with pride and relief. "I wouldn't have had the courage to speak up if I hadn't heard your story." Laura felt something shift in her chest, the quiet recognition that change rippled outward in ways you couldn't always measure or see. "You did the right thing, Airman. Don't ever stop trusting your training and your instincts." As the sun set over FOB Valor that evening, Laura sat outside her quarters and watched the stars emerge one by one against the deepening sky. She thought about all the paths that had led her to this moment. The years of training, the battles with bureaucracy, the crash that nearly claimed 8 lives, and the slow, difficult work of changing a culture that had forgotten how to listen. She thought about Major Brennan, learning humility through failure, about Lieutenant Chen, fighting her way back to service, about Captain Morse, flying with new reverence for the fragility of the machines that carried him, about the young maintenance tech who had found courage in her example. And she thought about all the future disasters that would never happen, because people had learned painfully, expensively, but genuinely that true strength wasn't found in certainty or rank or experience alone. It was found in the willingness to listen, to question, to adapt, and to speak truth, even when silence would be easier. A meteor streaked across the sky, brief and brilliant, and Laura smiled. Somewhere out there, systems were functioning safely because someone had cared enough to check them. Voices were being heard because someone had fought to make space for them. Lives were being saved because someone had refused to be silent. She had spent her career believing that her job was to heal the wounded and prepare for disasters. Now she understood that the real work The most important work was preventing the wounds before they happened and dismantling the systems that created disasters. In the first place, it was quiet work, often invisible, rarely celebrated, but it was the work that mattered most. And as Lavra stood and walked back inside, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring, she carried with her the knowledge that she had found her true calling, not in the dramatic rescues or the recognition, but in the steady, patient, relentless pursuit of a world where fewer rescues were needed because more people had learned to listen before disaster taught them to. The desert nights settled over Fob Valor, and somewhere in the darkness, systems hummed safely, voices spoke and were heard, and lives continued because someone had cared enough to fight for them. That, Lavra thought, was enough. That was everything.